welcome to today's Cancer COVID-19 Recovery Series webinar, where we're going to be talking about rapid modelling and recovery of endoscopy services, where Sarah and David are going to be talking around some work that has been done in South East London. So this is the final session in the series, and I'll be telling you a little bit more about what we've covered so far and what we're going to be covering today. But I'd very briefly like to introduce who we have on the call today. So we have David Ianson, a Cancer Commissioning Manager from NHS South East London CCG. And we also have Sarah Cooper, who works in the Elective Care Improvement Support Team and also the Transforming Cancer Services Team for London at NHS England and NHS Improvement. You're joined today by myself, Ash Mahanti. I work in the National Demand and Capacity Team at NHS England and NHS Improvement. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the series. So this has been a collaboration between the Demand and Capacity Team and the Elective Care Improvement Support Team. And we put this series of webinars together to support demand and capacity planning for cancer services in light of what's going on in the world at the moment with COVID-19. So it's looking around service recovery. The series was run over a period of 4 weeks. During the first webinar, it was about getting started with your demand and capacity journey, and that was aimed at individuals and organisations who were at the early stages of their demand and capacity journey, or folks who perhaps weren't more au fait with some of the principles that that are required to actually do one of these exercises. So we talked about the principles and behind this demand and capacity work in week 1. In week 2, we built on that and talked about how we could use the demand and capacity core model to support achieving the 28-day faster diagnosis standard and account for different ways of working in the current environment. So we were talking about service recovery, where you may have reduced demand and how you need to account for that returning to normal, accounting for different ways of working, such as virtual clinics, accounting for things such as PPE, and so on and so forth. In week 3, we ran through some diagnostic models, and we were talking around the principles and more technical aspects of how to go about completing and populating diagnostic models, focusing on MRI and CT, but also talking a little bit around endoscopy as well and how some of those principles could apply to that. It's very much waiting list sizes, so sustainable waiting list sizes, but also best practice cancer pathways. And today's webinar is actually going to build a little bit on that. So some of the technical detail was covered back then, but here we're actually going to look at how that's been put into practice in South East London. So David's going to be talking around rapid modelling and recovery of endoscopy services. So without further ado, I would now like to hand over to Sarah.
Hi everyone, thank you for choosing to watch the video. This is a really informative session about how to apply system-wide demand and capacity modelling for rapid endoscopy recovery, and as part of sustainability and transformation, so I hope you'll get lots out of this. I'm actually a few weeks into modelling demand and capacity for imaging and endoscopy myself across South West London and South East London sectors. Now that involves quite a number of trusts. So I'm really keen to hear David's experience again on how he tackled the modelling and the complexities and especially the lessons learned. So without further ado, there is a get through. I'd like to introduce David Ianson, a colleague in South East London who works across the ICS, CCG and Cancer Alliance. And he will talk through the background and why the demand and capacity modelling was initiated, setting the base, the outputs and the all-important lessons learned and the so what. So you've done the modelling, what next? That's a really important part of what as well. So David, over to you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Ash. And great to be with you today. So before I jump into this, I'll just explain a bit of background. There's multiple levels to this talk, and obviously the main bit will focus on the rapid modelling of endoscopy services, right in the kind of acute stages of when we were trying to bring capacity back online as quickly as possible. And that will link into kind of where we are at the moment within the region, which is around a more formal recovery programme. And then we'll also want to explore and touch on how that links with somewhere where we want to be in a few months' time, or during the spring or summer period, when we're looking at a more formal sort of sustainability and transformation of endoscopy in the kind of what we hope post-COVID period. What I will say before I go any further as well is I've not really gone into a lot of technical detail on how to do these things step by step, and that's quite intentional. Ben Douglas and Dan Whitehead covered this really, really well in last week's webinar. So if you want to look at how you complete a demand and capacity model to try and do some of these things, I would really recommend watching that webinar to learn how to do some of these things. And there are discussions as well about how we might be able to put on an additional supportive session for this to cover some of that technical detail, probably more focused on that rapid modelling side of things. So if we have a look at what we'll cover today, we'll go through a bit of background, just for a bit of context and scene setting. Under the rapid modelling area, we're going to look at some questions that we try to answer within a very short period of time, a few days, focusing on trying to understand how big is the problem that we have at the moment, what is our current demand and capacity, and also some scenario modelling around some of the immediate actions we could potentially do or explore to try and bring capacity or some capacity back. And then we'll cover the more formal recovery planning and monitoring, which is the phase that we're in at the moment, which is coordinated at a kind of regional level across London. And then lastly, we'll touch on how we want to transition that into recovery using demand and capacity for that's the sort of sustainability and transformation, which touches on some work we'd done pre-COVID over the last sort of 18 months, which used a traditional demand and capacity, more formal D&C analysis. What are some of the things we learned from that, and how we might take some of those things forward now. So a bit of background, Southeast London, we have 5 endoscopy units across 3 provider trusts. Typically pre-COVID, we would do about 1,000 endoscopies per week, and we've had historically high waiting lists. So our calculated sustainable size is around 2,600 points as a system, and our actual waiting list size when it was last formally measured in January was around 6,500 points, so well above the calculated sustainable level. And our units see largely similar levels of demand, although different varying profiles of urgency. Some might see very high urgent referrals and some more routine, but the levels are largely similar. But there's quite a lot of disparity in unit sizes and physical capacity, and so their ability to handle those similar levels of demand. So we do see quite a lot of inequity in our system in access to diagnostics. So this will probably be a phrase that is not unfamiliar to most who are within the endoscopy setting. And the story all really starts in the middle of March, when the BSG issued a statement pausing all but emergency endoscopy with the immediate effect. And in Southeast London, that looked like this. So on the left-hand side, you have the diagnostic or DEMO1 activity. And you can see when that BSG statement was issued, it falls right through the floor. So that has a significant impact on our waiting list, which you can see on the right-hand side, which from that point on just starts increasing. So that's really our starting point. So in terms of a bit of a timeline from that period onwards, kind of looked like this. So in March, when endoscopy was paused, obviously our capacity falls through the floor. What I will say is that this graph that I'm showing now is obviously not an accurate representation. It's purely just to demonstrate some of the theory here. And, the data does not actually look like this when you plot it out. So our capacity has dropped to near nothing. our referrals also, with a bit of lag, also do drop. And that lag is where you're seeing the increase in the waiting list. And then throughout the April, May and June period, there's a lot of local working, a lot of clinical group working, be that at kind of, at a South East London level, but predominantly mostly within units, within trusts and across and collegiate working across the system as well. But what we start to see in the sort of May and June period is referrals creeping back up. And our capacity is not keeping pace with that. So our waits are increasing, and our waiting lists and our backlogs are all increasing as well. Although all of that at that point is anecdotal. We don't at that point in time have anything as a system telling us how big that problem is. In July, in the first week of July, a pan-London endoscopy recovery program was initiated. And that meant that very, very quickly, within a space of a couple of days at the beginning of July, we had to carry out a very rapid modelling of what our position is. Well, trying to answer some of those questions around how the problem, what could we do initially, and really the purpose of that is to establish our baseline so that we can then start to plan recovery more formally within that program. And that's supported by some of the ongoing modelling that happens as part of that. So first of all, I just want to touch on the rapid modelling side of it and what we did there to establish that baseline. And then we'll move on to how that helped us when it came to planning within the more formal program. So the tools we had available between the 7th and 9th of July, when we had to carry out this rapid modelling, were very, very small in number. We really only had a current snapshot of the waiting list or the PTL. Now, this was very, very easy to get hold of because most units or teams will have easy access to that. Will probably be a general regular report that they get, or it will be a report that they're able to pull down themselves from their systems, or it is a very straightforward request to BIU, who should have easy access to that report. As I say, it's a very common request. And that PTL snapshot should include things around the date that the request was added to the waiting list, the intended procedure, the to come in date or the TCI date, and the waiting list category, be that waiting list planned or or however it's categorized on your waiting list. And all of that is very normal to that report. If you were going to do a more formal demand and capacity analysis, you would look at other data sets around additions to the waiting list over time. But that takes a lot of time to collate and clean. And the BIU teams at that point in time did not have the capacity or the headspace to be able to handle some of that level of bespoke reporting. So that wasn't a road we could go down. We purely had the current waiting list. We also had the rotas. So that was a very easy email or request or phone call to the team and ask them to just send over their current endoscopy, how it looked. And that was in a variation of these spreadsheets, Word documents, or even photos of a printout that was on the unit's poster board. And all of that could be collated into a simple model, which I'll show in a moment. Typically, you would use a more formal capacity model, which can be an example of which can be found in the core model. But again, these take time to build and take time to sense check what's on there. Is it right? Is it an accurate representation? None of which we could do within the time that we had. So those are the tools that we had available. So what are some of the things you can do when you have those two things? So first, and probably the most obvious thing you can do, is measure the size of your waiting list across all of your units and see how big those differences are across the system. And that looked like this. So the dark blue bar is the total waiting list in points as it was in January. So that's our pre-COVID kind of baseline. And the light blue bar is what it is in that measurement today, or as it was when we did this analysis. So you can see there's big across Southeast London. Sites 1, 4, and 5, you can see the waiting list is shot right up. So that's a concern. Sites 2 and 3, their waiting list has actually gone down, but that probably speaks more to the position they were in January, and the poor position they were in January, than it does for the narrative around what's happened during the last few months during COVID for them. The other important thing you can look at is the size of the backlog, and you can look at whether that backlog is stable. And that's what we've tried to do in kind of the red or pink bars that are shown there. Is you can see if the backlog is stable or is growing. Now, if it's stable, that implies that there is that implies that there or should be enough capacity to handle the demand coming through the door. Very crude way of doing it. It's not always a guarantee, but it's sort of adding clues to your story. And if the backlog is increasing, that is obviously a major concern, and a sense for a cause for concern at that particular unit. The other thing you can do is take a look at the composition of the waiting list. So what proportion of the waiting list is within its allocated waiting time or appropriate waiting time, and who isn't, and therefore falls within a backlog. And when you do that, you can pick out hotspots. So you can see here, sites 2, 4, and 5, they have a big backlog or a proportionally larger backlog than sites 1 and 3 in their 2-week wait and urgent requests. And so that's a problem, because it shows that there's inequity across our system in availability for those urgent requests. And so that is something we need to be aware of as a system and be tackling as a network. One point to say here is that we are defining backlogs slightly differently within this analysis. We are saying that 2-week wait and urgent requests that have been waiting more than 2 weeks are a backlog. And routines waiting more than 6 weeks of the backlog. Now, that's not normally how you would do this within a diagnostic setting. Typically, you'd look at 6-week waiters or beyond. But because of the nature of those pathways, 2-week waits and urgents, they need to be seen within 2 weeks. Otherwise, their pathway will not work. We are defining the backlog as that, if anything waiting over 2 weeks. So that's just something to be aware of in that slide. So we've established size and composition of the waiting list. So the big question, how can you measure your demand and your capacity with the tools we have available? So with demand, typically, if you were going to look at this in an traditional D&C style, you would look at multiple waiting list snapshots, you would look at additions to the waiting list over time, ideally minimum of 52 weeks. But we can't do that. We only have that single waiting list snapshot at the moment. So what could we do with that? One of the things you can do is use a basic calculation to look at the number of 2-week waits and urgents who have been waiting less than 2 weeks, divide that by 2, and it gives you the approximate number of those patients that have been added per week. If you do the same for the 6-week waiters, so routines waiting less than 6 weeks, divide that by 6, it gives you the approximate number of routine additions per week, or you can chop up that calculation however you want. But that is a very crude way of being able to look at the number of additions that are on your most recent waiting list. You can calculate the number of additions that have come on in those weeks. And that gives you can convert that into points using the intended procedure that's listed on the waiting list. And that gives you some estimation of demand. This is a very crude way of doing it, but it is actually, we found, relatively accurate when you compare this to more formal methods, which we did later on to sense check. What we found is that demand is about 50% of what we would usually expect. So that's really important to be aware of when you're talking about recovery and you talk about planning, because at some point we are going to have to be able to handle that additional 50% that's missing, and probably then some for backlog catch. So that was a really important position to be aware of. You know, what level of demand are we currently seeing, and what more demand is there that we need to be able to handle. Capacity is slightly easier because you measure this just from the rota, more or less. So if you take a rota, and this is a typical example of a rota in Southeast London, it has the description of the list that's running, it has the points that are on there, and it obviously has when those lists are running. And you can convert that into a very basic model. This was something bespoke that I put together, but equally you could put this in one of the core model capacity sections, and it would basically do the same thing around when it's running, the list description, which tells you, what type of demand it's able to see, the allocated points, so the capacity it's able to provide. And what I also found was very useful was applying a flag that would tell you whether it's, a mixed list, an upper GI, a lower GI, or a non-DMO1, non-diagnostic procedure, and or whether it's inpatient or bowel screening or general anesthetic list. All of these things are very useful to be aware of when you're trying to allocate tags to these sort of models, and they make it very useful for analyzing it later. Once you have that, you can repeat that across all the units with all the rotas that they send to you. You end up with something like this. So you pull it all together and you can tell all sorts of things when you have that data. You can tell how many rooms are still closed, how many, and you start asking the question around what they might need to reopen those rooms. You can look at the number of upper GI lists that are running, the number of lower GI lists that are running, lists that are for DMO1 or lists that are non-diagnostic. You could look at the amount of capacity coming from outside the NHS, the independent sector. You could look at carve out for inpatients. All of this is fantastic information to have, and it really builds to that story you're trying to tell of what's our current position, what's the drain on our resources, what could we move elsewhere or tinker with, and all of this information is enormously valuable when you're having those conversations. You also need to account for DNAs and cancellations, and that when you're talking in the context of rapid modeling is always just going to be a bit of an anecdotal conversation with units. But in my experience, that's not at all a bad way of doing it. Units always generally have a very good view of what their DNA rate is, and whenever I've compared that to an evidence base or a data set, it's always been to a large degree very accurate. And when you carry out those adjustments and you look at the capacity, you end up with your capacity available in points per week. So when you do that, you have your demand and you have your capacity. You can place them next to one another and tell what the balance is. So from here, you have the site-by-site breakdown, and you can see to a large extent, demand is roughly balanced with capacity, and across most units, so sites 1, 2, 3, capacity is above demand. So we're able to keep pace, or theoretically able to keep pace in those units. Sites 4 and 5 is a bit of a worry. So we've calculated that their capacity is less than the level of their demand, which fits with some of the story that was coming out of the waiting list analysis we did, where we were seeing that their backlog was slightly increasing and was unstable. So straight away, you can tell 4 and 5 might be a problem area where we need to focus on. So that said, demand might be roughly balanced with capacity, but demand is also only 50% of where it should be. And we don't know at what rate that's going to return. So it's quite likely that our ability to restore capacity is going to be slower than the return of that demand. So an obvious question then is, well, what could we do immediately to try and restore some of that capacity? So this is where we come on to some scenario modeling that we did. Some people will be familiar with this that happened, that at a time during the summer and the late spring, early summer, lower GI was clarified as a non-aerosol generating procedure, which is very important because it means that you can have a less enhanced IPC process for those procedures. So if you are able to run a lower GI list without that enhanced IPC, it means you can theoretically increase your throughput, arguably to a maximum of 12 points per list, but I'll caveat that in a minute. But if you run a mixed list, it prevents you fully realizing that gain, because it would, if you're mixing upper GI procedures which require that enhanced IPC, and you're only able, and you're running lower GI procedures at a higher points value or less enhanced IPC, it really prevents you realizing the potential gains on lower GI lists. So if you are able to unmix lists and run lower GI as a non-aerosol generating procedure and run that dedicated list as with more points on it, you increase your throughput. So what if units did that? And this is what we calculated as a model. So the red and green is what we saw on the slide a few moments ago. The grey bar that you can see is the model of, well, what points, where would you capacity get to if you took the current proportion of lower GI lists and you moved them all to 12 points? So if that unit is running, 3 lower GI lists a week, what if all of those move to 12 points? How much more would that give you? And some units increase, other units don't, and that is because for the most part they weren't running any lower GI lists. All of their lists were mixed. So there is no gain to make because there is no current proportion of lower GI lists. The yellow bar is what would happen is if we took all of the DMO lists, all the diagnostic lists on a rota, and you separated them all out into either upper GI or lower GI and a 40 to 60% favor to lower GI, and you moved all of those lower GI lists to 12 points. How much extra would that give you? And you can see there that there are a lot of gains to be made. At some sites in particular can see an awful lot of gain. And so that is clearly something to explore and a conversation to be having. There are some big caveats to this. One is obviously an awful lot more will determine your ability to run a list at 12 points, even if there is less IPC and your IPC is normalized, not least of which is the skill mix of your endoscopists. There will be other reasons why you might not get to 12 points, and they may not be IPC related or even COVID related. But the purpose of this modeling is just to show it the principle that you can do things and slightly tweak things based on the policies that you have available that can make a tangible difference on your throughput and your capacity. And those are the conversations that we need to be having in that acute moment when we are trying to establish our baseline and plan how we recover. So a quick summary of that, we found that our demand was 50% of pre-COVID levels, but there is variation between the units on that. We know that capacity at this moment is roughly balanced with current demand, but that's not likely to stay the case for very long. And we also know that there are some things we can do now or explore now to squeeze more capacity. And so the conversation then quickly turns to what do units need from the program in order to do those things. So that is a very whistle-stop tour of how you can do some rapid modeling and some of the models you might come up with to try and establish a baseline very, very quickly without the typical data sets you have to do a more formal D&C. So we've established our baseline, and what we want to move on to now is how that helped us form a plan within the more formal recovery program that we started with. So that more formal program it looked like this. It was initiated the first week of July, and anyone who colleagues in London will be very familiar with that week. A PMO was established, Program Management Office, which was charged with delivering this recovery program. It was very much coordinated at the regional level and the local level by cancer alliances and ICSs and STPs and so on. The rapid modeling that I've just gone through, that was very important in establishing a baseline position of which you can then start planning recovery from. And that recovery conversation mostly focuses on, well, what are the things that we could be doing now to either reduce demand or increase capacity? And those roughly fell into rough buckets of work, which is what we called them at the time. And they would be reducing demand, so the use of FIT to triage the waiting list and move patients away from endoscopy if not appropriate, or CT colonography, which is an alternate investigation for some people on an endoscopy waiting list. Other areas of work were around optimizing existing capacity, so extending our working hours or improving your ventilation to decrease downtime between cases and therefore increase the throughput on each case, and also infection control changes that may allow increases in optimizing capacity or increasing capacity. There's obviously another bucket around using the independent sector through outsourcing or insourcing. And also, new NHS capacity. So that would be estate works to convert non-endoscopy rooms into more endoscopy capacity, or new builds or modular builds. Once you start, a kind of apportioning potential activity that could be brought about, or additional endoscopy that could be brought about by doing some of these things, you can also start looking at, well, what would it cost, both in terms of capital and, staff costs and revenue to deliver some of those work streams. and bang for buck in those work streams, and your cost benefit of doing them. Do they give you enough activity for the investment that's required? Our role within the Alliance and Southeast London was to work with each of the sites as a network, as a collaborative effort to agree how much activity could be gained by doing each of these things, and what would be required to do them, both in terms of equipment, staffing or whatever else it may be, and the associated costs. What I will also do, this is just a very kind of brief point about the data we had available during that planning and in the early stages of that planning. As part of the more formal recovery program, there was a request from NHSEI to submit data daily, covering a number of metrics which I've set out there, but they basically just covered activity in procedure and points, the size of the waiting list, the number of additions per day to the waiting list, DNAs, sessions running, rooms running, and so on. It is, as you can imagine, a huge administrative burden to carry out that level of data collection and submission every day as a region. It takes up about an hour a day for most of the service managers and BI teams who are involved. So it does, we have a lot of concerns about using it or that system being in place. That being said, it is an enormously valuable data set to have when you are talking about monitoring the level of activity you have at the moment and how much is being brought about by doing these different things. So if you are having activity data submitted every single day, you have real-time data on what is the impact on activity by doing some of these things, and the impact on the waiting list. So it's kind of unequaled in terms of the value of having that data, but it is a huge administrative burden. But that having said that, it was very valuable when you're trying to have those conversations around planning. So this is kind of the output of that process. Is by about the end of July, we needed to have had these plans finalized. And once you have a plan, you can then start monitoring against it. And it kind of fell into a weekly rhythm where we were monitoring activity versus the plan, the elements of risk, what needed to happen when to deliver certain parts of this plan. And having a networked approach to that is really important, so that you can be articulating, if you're procuring equipment as a system that has a lot more kind of power behind it and a lot more sway than individual providers trying to articulate or prioritize themselves above other providers in the region. So our plan at the bottom there is kind of shown out in a graph, and the blue dotted line is the pre-COVID levels of activity. That's the primary target for the program, is to get to that level and ideally beyond it to start reducing backlogs. The baseline activity is where we start our planning, and I've covered some of that in the recovery modeling, but it also is supplemented by the daily activity data that's being submitted, so we can understand where we are now. And then the different activities that we've planned as part of this, we'll start bringing online different additional activity or additional endoscopy to recover the service, ideally up and beyond that blue dotted line. And that's what those charts show. So those are split into, tangible examples such as, sites 4 and 5 opening 2 additional rooms each, and, additional lists and day surgery, and increased activity because of IPC or ventilation changes, which allow increases in throughput. But once you know what needs to happen and when, you can then start articulating, well, our local exhaust vents need to be delivered by the middle of August. It's for us to bring those online by the beginning of September. And to be running those additional lists in September, we need our equipment to have been delivered by the beginning of September. So having this plan laid out and having an idea of what activity is going to come about as a result of these helps you prioritize and form the conversation that you're having at that time. So a huge value in having that plan set out across the system. Everyone needs to know what they need to do and by when. It also allows you to monitor your progress against that plan. So this is Southeast London, and the purple line is our plan as we submitted it, and the blue line is how we've tracked against it. So obviously we're well below that, but still above pre-COVID levels of activity, and we are seeing that in the backlog and the waiting list with them reducing. So really, I can't really emphasize how much work has gone into getting it to that point, and all credit to the units for doing that, because it just takes so much to be performing at that level. So just a huge shout out to them. Although we are using the daily data that takes place in London to do this, I think you could do this with the weekly DMO1 submissions that take place anyway as part of COVID recovery. You'd probably have a 2-week delay just because some of the validation exercises that have to happen within that data set. But basically, I think that you can recreate this using some of those data flows that already exist. I don't think there's necessarily a need to focus on a daily data submission. So we're now in a position in South East London where we're delivering above pre-COVID levels of activity. The waiting lists and the backlogs are reducing, but they are still very large. And there's a lot of unknowns about the future and the impact on endoscopy where we are, especially right now in the middle of wave 2, in the middle of winter pressures. So we cannot by any means be considered recovered. But at some point, the conversation is going to move towards this out of this intensive focus on day-to-day recovery and sort of continuity of services into that more kind of strategic planning and future-proofing capacity. So this is probably a conversation we'll start having in the spring or summer, ideally when we're in the kind of post-COVID era, or certainly more stable within endoscopy. And to start having that conversation, you really need to start transitioning from a recovery modeling and tracking process, which is where we are now, into a more formal demand and capacity analysis, which will be of enormous value when you're having that conversation. So that more formal D&C, we have been doing that since June of 2019, where we did a sort of unit by unit comprehensive D&C analysis, which was primarily to look at the current position and also model different scenarios to see what impact they would have if you did different things. So how much capacity is added by doing these different things. And that exercise was repeated in August 2019 and most recently in January of this year. And that most recent analysis looks like this. So this is generally how you would present demand and capacity results and outputs, and this is what you'll see on a completed core model. And you can see it's broken down by site, and you can see August of 2019 and January 2020 there, and you can see the difference or what's changed between each site's position in between those times. So you can see site 1, for example, has gone from a position of having just being able to meet their 85th or arguably or not quite being able to meet that, because the only way they get to that is through their capacity that's carved out for non-elective demand. But if you then look at January, they have completely turned that around and are now well above their 85th. And we were seeing that in January, where they were reducing their waiting list and their capacity was sufficient to handle the demand coming through. And you can see demand profiles have changed across the system as well, where demand has generally gone up site by site, and capacity has flexed to increase that, or some units are more challenged than others. Most notably, site 3, for example, sees an enormous number of inpatients, which has a significant impact on their capacity and therefore their ability to cope with that demand. So this is an example of some of the kind of system views you can have when you do this analysis across a region or across a system, is that you kind of have that kind of helicopter view of everything that's going on, and you can start to apply to that some narrative around some of the problems that might exist in certain units, and that then leads you to conversations around what you might be able to do about them. So adding on to that, what you might be able to do about them element of this is there were lots of conversations around operating models, like ways of working, or the way that the unit structures its working pattern. So on the left, you have a 7-day working pattern, which we're calling scenario 2A, and on the right you have a 7-day working pattern but with twilights during the week, and you can start to see what impact each of these ways of working have if you were to do those changes at each of the units. So at the top you have the unit by unit breakdown, and you can see what would happen if they moved to 7 days, which is the dark blue bar. What would happen if they moved to 8% DNAs or cancellations, which is the yellow, and what happens if they were running 48 weeks per year, which is the green. And you can see on the left, sites 1 and 5 see a big shift up in capacity if they are able to move to 7-day working. So clearly that's something we might want to explore with those sites, whereas sites 2, 3 and 4 don't have that much because they are already working 7 days a week. And twilights, you can see on the right, they do add a lot of capacity, or a marginal amount of capacity, but at what cost? So it's not really, maybe that's something that you might not want to explore. It might not add enough capacity for the cost that is required of running a model like that. So we settled on this, what we call a future operating model, which is 7 days a week, 48 weeks per year, with no more than 8% DNAs or cancellations. And that is agreed as a system to be the way that we should be operating across all units in South East London. That should be the agreed way. That should be the agreed way of working. So then you start talking about, well, what would units need to get to that point? Is it workforce? Is it banks of endoscopists? Is it better rates of pay at the weekend? What is it that's needed, and how can the system help them get there? You also, when you're modeling as a system, need to take account of growth, because certain things that you're planning will take time to bring online, and you don't want to get to a point where you're constantly chasing your tail, trying to catch up. And you can model out this growth. I will emphasize the fact that this is a model. It's not by any means necessarily a prediction. So you can generally apply it within the context of endoscopy. You can apply a 6.5% growth factor year on year to the demand, and that's something we've seen in literature as a roughly accurate way of doing it. Obviously, you will have variation in years on that rate. But if you were to plot that out, and you also plot out the capacity available at the moment and where you are at your future operating model, you can start to see how far each of those ways of working get you. So if we were to change nothing in South East London, and we were to continue working in the way that we were pre-COVID, and our demand increased by 6.5% year on year, we only have till about 2022-23. But if we were all able to move to the future operating model, that gets us a couple more years, which is enough to build modular units and really increase capacity, or develop staffing models and so on. So when you have this model, you can really emphasize the priority or the urgency around having some of these conversations, because we're already looking at this chart, we're about to hit year 3, so we are only really a year to 18 months away from really struggling with our current operating model pre-COVID, which had a lot of reliance on insourcing and the independent sector, which is not a very sustainable way of working. So we need to be having conversations now as a system to discuss how we're going to move our capacity levels up to keep pace with this chart, well beyond year 10 into the future. So some of our medium-term goals that are informed by that work are obviously this agreement to have a future operating model of 7 days a week or equivalent, 48 weeks per year, and no more than 8% lost or unused slots. We were also exploring our insourcing, outsourcing contracts with a view to be potentially pooled, to have more of a collective deal, although COVID has a significant impact on that with the IS contracts in play at the moment. We agreed to recruit 4 fellows to support South East London as a system, as almost as a bank of endoscopists that could support the workforce, and we have or are currently recruiting to those posts. We identified there was an urgent need to increase capacity at site 2 with a minimum of 2 additional rooms, so we can start supporting business case planning and moving that forward at that site, because the whole system has agreed that this is necessary, and you can throw the weight of the system behind that business case. And there's also a more medium-term plan around a further additional 2 rooms by 2025 or 26. And so we need to start having conversations around where they might be and what sites could support them. And then there's also this conversation around transforming this. It was originally a task and finish structure, and it's now moved into this endoscopy network, which is, one of the benefits of COVID is the networked approach around endoscopy and recovery of endoscopy is that we will just continue that structure in a slightly different way and much less intensely. But certainly the network has appetite to continue, and people have seen enormous value in it. And within that, probably in the spring or summer, we'll look to do a more formal demand and capacity analysis, and probably repeating every 6 months or more regularly as is needed to keep understanding the current position, how it's changing, the growth in demand that we're seeing, and the progress against those more medium-term or long-term goals. And that will be a key part of the work that we want to achieve. So some of the lessons that we've learned during all of this. It is all about data. That is fundamental to a lot of the stuff that I've gone through today. So when you are asking for data, even if that's in the rapid modeling context, or if you're looking at a more formal demand and capacity analysis, you need to be absolutely clear on what you're using it for, why you're asking for it, and some of the limitations of the data set that you're requesting. So rapid modeling, the data set is going to be much more limited in what you can use it for than a data set that you would request for a demand and capacity analysis. And I've also found that it's very useful to have someone in place who can be that kind of mediator between the informatics team and the service team, because they will not use the same language. So to get the best out of both of them, it's just helpful to have someone who can kind of mediate that conversation and make sure that the service gets what it needs, and informatics have the right definitions for what they've been asked for. It's also important to know that it's a very iterative process. It's going to take time to build these things, especially if you're doing a more formal analysis. And you just need to focus on answering some smaller questions first and build it up from there. So focus on understanding your current position and then approach the whole scenario modeling question. And just be prepared to make mistakes, and absolutely be prepared to not understand this straight away. Like I definitely didn't when I first started. So you just have to be patient with yourself in that sense. And just know that it will take time. And relationships are really key. We were quite beneficial in Southeast London when we approached this rapid modelling exercise and the recovery modelling, in that we'd already done some of this demand and capacity work. So we had established relationships with the services and with the BIU teams. But if you don't have that, it is well worth the time investing in establishing those relationships and making clear what you need from people and why you need it. To get that engagement, to build that trust, to be able to use the right people and the expertise that you have. And lastly, I cannot underestimate the value of this. It has been of enormous value for a number of things that we have done. Not all, not by no extent have all of them been listed here. And it is just fundamentally understanding where you are so you can then plan where you need to be is something that sounds very easy, but when you try and do it, as I'm sure many people have, it can quickly unravel. So that just goes back to being patient with yourself and making sure that you're doing this in the right way, and be focused on the value of the end product that you need to get to. And if you're in a position where you have a good baseline, you know where you are, you can start tweaking where you need to be and make plans. And once you have that, it's much easier to just quickly refresh and redo. I really can't emphasize how valuable it is to have that. And once you've got the model, that's not your output. Once you have created your core model or your your system view of demand and capacity and whatever you're modeling, that isn't your output. It's what you do with it. The value of what we've done here is not about the models and the graphs we've created. It's all about the conversations that we've had, the network we've developed as a result, and the goals that those networks have agreed, and all the conversations and the people we get involved in achieving those goals. The modelling that we've done is very much to support it, and is not the primary aim. The primary aim is what can we do to increase that capacity, recover our services, and future-proof endoscopy. So that's it. Bit of a whistle-stop tour. So my contact details are there, and I'm very happy for you to contact me for any questions. And Sarah, I know you want to come in here.
Yeah, I just want to thank you, David, for such an impressive presentation covering how to apply demand and capacity modelling as part of recovery, and to sort of support more strategic planning and sustainability and transformation. I think you covered just about everything. I think it'll be really, really helpful. So it was interesting to see the objectives that you're working towards, or meetings, to sort of reduce the demand and increase the capacity. Also really valuable to sort of see how the benefits of working collaboratively across the system. It's no mean feat doing something like that. So you know, really, it was really good to see how working in this way has helped endoscopy, and actually this methodology is not limited. You can apply this to other services as well. So as David said, if you have any inquiries, then please get in touch with him. His email is on the slide. As Ash said, I work for the Transforming Cancer Services team, which are part of Healthy London Partnership, and they sort of bring together London's health and care system to improve cancer outcomes and wait times. So we work with a variety of partners, and I work particularly close with the elective care improvement support team. So they have a suite of tools and guidance and resources, and we've also included the link to their futures page and their website there, so that'll be really helpful. But feel free to contact me as well for any further information about supporting with demand capacity or pathway analysis, or any other kind of modelling. So thank you, and over to Ash to close the session.
Thank you very much for that, Sarah. And thank you very much for that, David. Really, really excellent presentation, and actually a really nice note to actually end the series on. So in the final slide, I'd like to tell you a little bit more about some of the resources that we have. So do feel free to visit the Demand and Capacity website to learn a little bit more about our offer and look at some of the other tools and resources that we have available to support service planning. If you'd like to be kept abreast of any developments in the demand and capacity world, you can sign up to our bulletin, and details of how to do that over there. And please do join our Future NHS platform. The recordings of the previous webinars that we alluded to at the start of this session are available over there, as are recordings of previous sessions that we have held, along with other resources, including models, case studies, and other things which I'm hoping you may find useful. If you're on social media, particularly Twitter, do follow our program lead, Sandra. Her details are over there. She posts occasionally on Twitter with updates as to what's going on in demand and capacity world. So I would like to finally thank you for your time. I'm hoping this video has been useful. If you'd like to learn anything else, or you'd like to ask any further questions, do get in touch with us. Our details are available on our website, so our email address is over there. If you'd like to get in touch with Sarah and David directly, please also do that using their details in the previous slide. So once again, I'd like to thank you and hope you enjoyed this video and found it useful. Thank you very much.